don't know who I am, but I know all about you. I've come to talk to you tonight about the things I've seen you do. I've come to set the record straight. I've come to shine the light on you. Let me introduce myself. I am the cold hard truth.
We'll film a thing with Prince Harry. He contacted me about doing a charity video with him, which you know is going to be good. Hey mate, how you doing? Nice to see you.
Someone with your skill set to be able to write lyrics and of a song to raise awareness, I think would be amazing.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly what I'm trying to do. People just don't understand what it's like for people like us.
Yeah, I mean, what?
Well, you know, like with the jokes and the snide comments, and you know, I just feel like it's time that we stood up and said, you know, we're not going to take this anymore. We are Ginger, and we're going to fight.
Okay. This might maybe a miscommunication, but this is about World Mental Health Day.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, no, I knew that. No, I definitely knew that. Yeah, definitely knew that.
Guys, this World Mental Health Day, reach out, make sure that your friends, strangers, look out for anybody that might be suffering in silence.
Okay, folks, good evening and welcome to another segment of the Cold Hard Truth. I'm your host, Sandy Hill. We're going to be here for the next hour or so. So as you guys notice, we actually have the ability to now have video as part of our live stream segment. So I'm going to be rewatching this to see how that played and how that sort of kicked off. I did notice that someone said there was no audio, so we're going to have a look at that. But our intro, what a lot of you guys don't know is our intro music has actually always been a video. So the Cold Hard Truth song that we play, it's actually video, but we never had the ability to pull in the video feed. So you were only just ever hearing it. So that's how we'll now be starting the show, and any kind of video uploads that we have, we can certainly incorporate those into the program as we're doing the live stream. All right, folks. So thank you so much for joining this evening's program. It's basically going to be a part 2 or a continuation of Tuesday's show, which was on domestic violence and some cases that we were going over. There were so many comments, and unfortunately I could not get to all of the comments from that show. But you know, tonight we have to continue the conversation, and quite interestingly enough, today I had the privilege of attending, because today is World Mental Health Day, and I had the privilege of attending a symposium at the Hartwell theater that had a number of attendees, including mental health professionals. There were some students there from both Clifton Hunter and John Gray. And they did a production of Dr. Frank's play, Downside Up, which talks about and illustrates, dysfunctional families and abusive situations. And there was quite a bit of physical abuse in that play. There was definitely emotional and mental and psychological abuse going on as well, and a little bit of financial dependency and financial abuse. So it was my first time seeing the production. And I must say that I was extremely impressed with Giselle, Jevi, Jaren, and there's 2 other cast members, I'm afraid. Sorry, I don't know their names, but they all did a fantastic job, honestly. If you haven't seen it, I'm hoping that there will be future productions. And it's very deep. It's a heavy topic, and it's obviously very, very deep, but I would say well worth seeing, because it's reality for a lot of people. There are a lot of people who are living in abusive homes. So on Tuesday's show, we were talking about, some of the issues that may have led to a young man, Mr. Davian Keneal Thompson, basically taking his life. And I do have a little bit of an update on that situation that I think is interesting. I wish to share with you guys. What we have since discovered is apparently, they found his body on a couple days ago. But what we've actually discovered is, it seems from all of the sources that I have, that in fact, Mr. Thompson actually took his life shortly after the incident. So I know there were a lot of people who had sent us information that they thought that he was still on island over the weekend and that he was attempting to leave the island. As it turns out, it now looks like he actually believed that he probably did kill his wife, or that she was going to die because her injuries were so severe. That he went pretty much straight away to the location where they eventually found him, because by the time they found him the other day, he was already starting to decompose. So it does appear, and I just wanted to clarify that, not because we're into the grotesque, but because I know a few of you were kind of curious about, I've even had some people, they have a theory that he didn't actually kill himself and that someone else did it, and so on. And it looks like, it looks like what it is, which was what he thought in his mind was actually a murder-suicide, that he had murdered his victim, or that she was going to die from her injuries, and so he just went straight away and took his life. So by the time that they found him, he was already decomposing, basically. So again, that whole situation is very sad. It's just a sad situation, and I'm sure if he was here and he had it to do all over again, he probably would have made some very different decisions. So we're going to continue talking about domestic violence. I mean, the symposium today was really, really good. I must say that I enjoyed the dialogue. Now, today's focus is going to be another case that is very unlike the Thompson situation with him and his wife. They appear to have been lower income individuals, struggling to pay bills, struggling to make ends meet. On the one hand, the alleged wife, who is a victim in many ways, she is twice the age of the husband. There were immigration concerns. There were allegations that perhaps she was potentially controlling him by way of, immigration. And so the case we're going to look at today involves a partner at Maples and Calder, and it's almost like the complete opposite scenario from that other case, but yet still domestic violence involved. Thankfully, in this case, no one has yet lost their lives, so that's good so far. But again, domestic violence doesn't have any sort of limits. And being that today is World Health Day, I think it's really, really important for people to understand how living in a domestically violent environment or home impacts your mental health and every aspect of your being. So we're going to talk about and continue to have that dialogue. But of course, I know tons of you are already tuned into the program. So let's do our usual greetings for the evening. Irvlyn, good evening and welcome to the program. I love your, by the way, I know that recently you changed your profile picture, and I wanted to say you look beautiful, and I absolutely love it. Shara, thank you so much for tuning in as well. And Shara's got a photo of her little dog. Melissa, good evening. Thank you so much. You're looking nice and slim in your photo. Sometimes we don't always get to the photos, the little, your profile picture up so small in this chat. So I'm just like looking at some of them tonight. Sora, looks like she did a throwback photo as her profile photo, which she's had up for a while. Shari says police have told her to get a restraining order. I'm not sure which victim you're talking about. Is it the one that got assaulted by Thompson, or is it the lawyer's wife? Nathan, thank you so much for tuning in. You're always here for it. We really, really appreciate the support. And Nathan's looking really nice and handsome there with his nicely shaved beard. He's got that all done up in his profile photo and some nice sunglasses on. Beverly says this is very sad. Condolences to both families. And I mean, absolutely, there are no winners in a situation like this. There is no one that is going to be walking away from this unscathed. Everyone is being touched by seems like the internet just dropped out completely. So I think we're now back. Yeah, the internet just dropped. I don't know. Internet providers, what can I tell you? Yeah, so all of a sudden the internet just dropped out and we were bleep, gone. So we're gonna start talking about the lawyer one. Let me just read a few of your comments that came in. I do see Shara confirming that she was actually talking about the Thompson case, that she was told to get a restraining order. So again, you know, even without a restraining order, you do think that the police would be able to do something about that. You know, if someone assaults you, you don't have to have a restraining order for the police to enforce that. So, it's just crazy. But I think there has to be a lot of retooling and retraining of police officers as well. Okay, so let's have a look at this case. We're going to move along now. So David Marshall is his name. He is an attorney, not just an attorney, but he's actually a partner at Maples. And of course, Maples is the top law firm on the island. I don't know, between them and Walker's, they're kind of neck and neck, I think. But most people see them as kind of being in the lead. It's possible that they're on par with each other, but they're definitely a premier, big law firm, have hundreds of employees, hundreds of attorneys probably at this point. And he is one of multiple partners in the firm. And their website has a nice biography up about him and what sort of work he does. And he has been charged with, and I want to make this very, very clear, it's a felony offense. He has been charged with felony battery, aggravated great bodily harm. Now, one of the interesting things about this particular case is, again, social status aside, it doesn't seem to matter where you're from or how much money you make or even who you are. Anyone is capable of being a victim, and anyone is capable of being a perpetrator. So this man has assaulted his wife. We were able to actually get the case information, which is available through the Miami-Dade County office. And there's quite a bit of details and information in this. So, one thing about the states, you gotta give them credit. They don't hide information. They don't cover things up like what happens often here in the Cayman Islands. You feel like you can't get access to information here and you never know what's going on. So this is a case information sheet that we were able to obtain, and it has the full case number, his name, his date of birth. He was actually celebrating his birthday in South Beach when this assault took place. So this was over the past weekend. And this tells you in the docket section, like everything that's happened, like the intake unit was assigned. So it was assigned under felony domestic crimes. And I know it's hard for you guys to see this at the very bottom, but this is in the article on the website. So if you've not had a chance to read the article, you can go, sorry, and see this document there. So he had a public defender appointed at his bond hearing, which is interesting because you think as a big time lawyer, he'd be able to get, first rate attorney and not have to rely on a public defender. He had his first hearing, bond hearing. And then it says current bond status, PC found CT1 ROR. They issued a stay away order, which is a pre-trial conditional victim situation. Now, let me sort of explain something in terms of that part of things, right? In the States, and this is where legislation is so incredibly important. In the United States of America, if a police officer shows up to a domestic incident or domestic abuse, and a lot of you guys may have seen this if you watch like A&E, sorry, when the cameras follow people, officers around, and they make arrests. If they show up to a domestic situation, somebody is getting arrested, and they tell people that all the time. The law dictates that they have to take one of the two parties away. And they obviously try to make an assessment as quickly as possible of who is actually responsible in the situation, because it's not always clear and it's not always easy to ascertain who was at fault. So for example, if they're having a domestic fight, sometimes the wife is actually the aggressor. Sometimes she's the one who is beating the crap out of her husband. It doesn't have to always be the man or always be the husband. Although I think, to be fair, in the vast majority of cases, it is, but you have to accept that a police officer can't go into any situation having made that assumption. So in this case, the facts are that his wife was actually found passed out by a hotel room, like she was in the hallway. And when they discovered her, this is his wife of 15 years, okay? When they discovered her passed out, they noticed that she had significant injuries. She was actually unconscious. She wasn't just passed out from being drunk. She was unconscious with injuries to the left side of her face. The security manager at the hotel immediately called 911. She was transported by ambulance and treated at the Mount Sinai Hospital in that area of Miami. And a doctor noted that she had at least 3 fractures. Now this is your facial bones, right? So you know to fracture a bone in your face takes some degree of force. She had at least 3 fractures to the left side of her face and surrounding the eye area. So she probably had fractures here and maybe to the side, and a laceration next to the same eye. Those are serious. I want to really stress the seriousness of being charged with a felony when it comes to GBH or assault. It's quite serious. I'm going to read a definition in a bit about what constitutes a felony, right? So then the security officer went and viewed the CCTV footage to, number one, try to figure out who this woman is. Like, you can imagine being a security officer and just finding a woman passed out on the hall of your hotel, no identification, you don't know who she is, nothing of the sort. So the logical thing for him to have done was go back to the CCTV footage, which apparently he did. And he saw the couple go into their room about 2:49 in the morning. Then he observed the wife holding a towel to her face and walking down the hallway. So evidently, from the looks of what transpired, they both went into the room at 2:49. She was assaulted at some point. It didn't say how long they were in there for, but she reemerged, walked down the hallway, and just fell unconscious, passed out in front of another room further down the hall. And so the manager then did a security check of the room, and he found signs of an altercation, so probably the furniture and whatever. And he woke Mr. David Marshall up. Marshall admitted to being out drinking and having had an argument with his wife, and he claims that he could not recall anything further. Then he proceeded to go to the hospital to visit his wife. The staff members at the hospital, they're the ones who actually alerted the police to a possible domestic battery. And it seems like what was happening was he was actually trying to concoct the story along with the wife of something that happened, and the hospital staff were like, no, the story doesn't match with her injuries, something's off here. We think this is a domestic situation. And, you know, once again, they have a legal obligation in the States, in any event, to alert the authorities right away. So you kind of get the feeling that here in Cayman, this doesn't always happen. Depends on who you are, who you know, all these other factors. But in the States, they tend to really follow the laws with certain things. And so the hospital staff alerted the police, and then a Miami-Dade police officer actually attended the hospital right away. And the first thing he did was to separate Marshall from his wife. Now, this is key because, as you guys know, a lot of women and men, victims, they have been victimized for a long time, and they're in a victim's mentality. So they will lie about what happened to them. I walked through a door, I bruised myself, you know, a chair hit me. Like, they come up with all kind of fanciful versions of what happened, other than to just tell you, because there is a stigma with domestic abuse. No one wants to tell you that their husband used them as a punching bag, and that's how they got that bruise. So it appears that he was already there at the hospital, based on this report that we've obtained, trying to cover up the situation with the wife. And so it actually said, after separating, in the report, it said, after separating him from the victim, this is what the police officer said, I attempted to have a conversation with him, stated the officer in the complaint arrest affidavit. At first, he was not making any sensible statements. He had an odor of alcohol emitting from his mouth and had slurred speech. He was unable to maintain his balance. So I'm assuming he took a taxi to the hospital. He obviously was in no driving condition, right? The defendant also had scratches on him that he could not explain. So whatever story they were trying to concoct simply did not explain those injuries that he had, which were probably more defensive wounds and stuff as well. So Shara says he should be ashamed of himself for abusing his wife. First of all, he's a professional, and he's in one of the top law firms. Yeah. So Nathan has joined in. Thank you, Nathan. He said he's supposed to be enjoying his birthday, not beating his wife. And then Petra said, is this a general issue on the island? Now, when you say general issue, do you mean domestic abuse? Because domestic abuse happens, in my mind, all over the world. Cayman is certainly no exception. I think there's some unique factors to it in terms of how it is handled, how it's treated, how victims respond to the domestic abuse, whether they're inclined to report it and so on. That plays into some of the cultural aspects of the situation. So again, I think domestic violence happens all over the world, all socioeconomic classes. Now we see this as a lawyer. I'm sure he's making 25 grand a month easily, what I know of Maple's partners. And he is no different than, the construction worker who goes home and beats up his wife, to be honest. Except this guy dresses in a suit. And as Shara said, because someone is a professional and they dress in a suit, maybe we as a society have an expectation of them that they know better because, they're educated. I mean, you're educated in the law of all things, for heaven's sake. So you should know better, but that doesn't matter. If somebody is an abuser, they are an abuser no matter what. Doctors, lawyers, professors, it simply doesn't matter. So he was not able to explain his scratches. And in addition to that, he claims that he did not recall what happened. And then the wife started to say as well, she couldn't recall what happened. She just knew that they got drunk and had an argument. I don't know. I mean, I've never been assaulted like that, but even if you're drunk, and I've personally never been drunk, but do tell me, you guys might know this, even if you're drunk and someone assaults you, do you not remember that you were assaulted? I mean, does the alcohol, impair your ability to remember what happened? I would think that the assault was of such a nature that it would have certainly stood out. That's just me. So if you guys have any better understanding of how that works, then let me know. So Cameron says, right on, if he had done that in Cayman, we would have never known. And I believe that because even if we would have known about it, it would have disappeared. Nothing would come of it. Because here in Cayman, they seem to really rely upon, and in other jurisdictions like the US, they do not need a victim to cooperate with the prosecution any longer. That law was changed a long time ago in the UK, in the US. And in my mind, it doesn't seem like it's changed here in the Cayman Islands. Because if the victim decides not to proceed, they don't have a case, is what you always hear. And we've seen that happen a couple times. Some years ago, there was a high-ranking person in a government agency that had allegedly attacked his wife or girlfriend. And he was arrested, and the matter was starting to go through the court system. And then she became uncooperative. And the police well, without the victim, there's nothing that we can do. And I guess in certain situations, it may be that you don't have any independent evidence, and so it is difficult to prosecute. But in this case, you have an injured woman with injuries. You have CCTV footage demonstrating that she went into the room with this man, her husband, that she came out of the room at some point without him, and she had a towel to her face. She was already injured, obviously, and she went down the hall and passed out. So what else would have caused her injuries then, basically, is the question. And this officer seems to be well trained because that is why he separated them, so he could talk to her separately and talk to him separately. So apparently at some point she'd initially agreed to have her photo taken for the prosecution, for the file, and then she changed her mind. And this really speaks to the fact that chances are this is not the first go around for them. This is not the first time that he's probably assaulted her. And she's trying to now cover up for him and protect her lifestyle, protect her way of living or whatever. And that's normally what happens. You know, we think that just because you're in a higher economic bracket, you are less likely to be dependent on this man, but that's not always the case. You've been married to him for 15 years. Chances are she's probably never worked a day in her life. She's allowed him to be the primary breadwinner of the family. She's, you know, they have 3 children together. She's probably raised her own children. She's a stay-at-home mom, you know, the ones that you see, you know, that have time for play dates during the week. They don't have to work and take care of children. They're just taking care of the children. They're homemakers, which is fine, you know, if you've got a spouse that can do that. But just because, you know, you might live in $1 million home, you drive a nice fancy car, that doesn't mean that you do not have a fear of that lifestyle, number one, disappearing. And number two, your lifestyle changing so much or so drastically as a result of, you know, the demise of the relationship, that even if you're being abused, you would rather protect your abuser and hide that situation and hide that stigma of your friends knowing. Now, I don't know David Marshall, but I'm sure a lot of people in this country probably do know him. He's got hundreds of coworkers at Maples that now know that he's an abuser, allegedly, and that his wife is a potential victim, whoever she is. And so, you know, it is what it is, and this is a small country. But even in the US, look at this, they have no qualms about naming him. He was up on websites with arrest records and arrest information, and all of this information is available and in the public domain. So it says here that, just going through some of this again, the stay away order was issued. It's a pre-trial condition for the victim. So that means essentially that he has got to stay away from her and he can have no contact with her. Now, I don't know the logistics of that, how that will work if she's back in the Cayman Islands. I mean, the court obviously can't control, although they've given him this order, they can't control what his behavior is in a separate jurisdiction. Then apparently he applied for permission to travel on the 6th. So all of this was done very, very quickly. There was a demand for discovery. So in other words, now this would be his lawyers, his public offender asking for discovery, meaning like what evidence does the prosecution have to even bring this case? Little did he know, I guess, about the CCTV footage. He also, it says, demand for trial by jury. So that's interesting. He wants a trial by jury. Affidavit for indigent status. And then it said not indigent. So I'm assuming indigent status, meaning that he's unable to pay for himself. So that was done on the 7th, and they found not indigent, defense attorney, PDE, some of these things we don't know, but it looks like he probably had hired at that point a defense attorney instead of just a public defender. Then he requested permission to travel. So there was a motion for permission to travel. filed on the 8th, set for the 8th at 12:14, and it was actually granted. So presumably that means he is now back in the Cayman Islands because he wanted to travel. And then it says acknowledgement of appointment, a written plea of not guilty, notice of discovery, demand for jury trial, a waiver of pre-trial conference. So he's actually pleaded not guilty in spite of all of this. And then his defense attorney is someone by the name of Patrick J. It looks like Nally, and order granting permission to travel. So he looks like by the 8th, which would have been Wednesday, the order granting permission to travel. So presumably he is now back in the Cayman Islands and then awaiting his trial date in the US, which he will have to return for. His law firm has been expectedly quiet because Maples, that's the kind of firm that they are. They're not going to have anything to say. They're not going to make any public statements. As far as we know, he's still very much employed with the firm. There was a definition given of what he's charged with, section 609.02. Great bodily harm means bodily injury which creates a high probability of death or which creates serious permanent disfigurement. And so I thought that definition was very, very important to share with you guys, because when we first posted this story, there were some people who were making light of this about, oh yeah, you know, maybe he wasn't happy with his birthday gift or this or that. And this is really not anything to laugh about or to make fun about. This is a serious indictment on him for sure. And it's sad that his wife was attempting to assist him in covering this up. And of course now, you know, maybe she's thinking about his reputation. If he loses his job at Maples and Calder, which if he did this, he should. There should be no ifs, ands, or buts about that. If he loses his job, now she loses her position in the community. She loses maybe her lifestyle, her big house, her, you know, children going to private school, whatever. And this is the thing that gets me. I mean, people, when they make these decisions, it's like they don't think about the fallout of how it all happens, you know, and how it's going to impact everyone around them. Cameron says America has a constitution, Cayman has a crown. Well, Cayman has a constitution as well, and I don't think it's really a constitutional issue. It's a question of having very, very strict laws in place and making sure that the police officers, the medically trained personnel, like everyone who's involved in the intake process of, you know, being in contact with a potential victim are well aware of what they need to do to make sure that if they suspect a case of domestic battery, that they report it to the authorities right away. And in this particular case, that is precisely what happened. Okay, so Shar says, I was told that back in the olden days, you were told to keep your business in your home, not to tell people, so abuse was never spoken about. And you know, Shara, this was one of the things that we discussed at the symposium today, especially in our Caribbean culture. Sorry. It still is very much taboo. And it is still something that is seldom talked about. You know, people hide behind the walls of domestic violence. And like I said, there can be a myriad of reasons why that happens, why people refuse to speak out. Like I said, sometimes they're afraid. You know, women often leave and go back, leave and go back. And so they don't even want people to know that they are suffering in that sort of a situation. They don't want people to judge them. And we do live in a community where, let's be fair, people judge you a lot. And it is what it is, right? And no one wants to have that stigma of being the abused, being the victim. And so you find that, unfortunately, a lot of women will stay in the situation and continue time and time again to be subjected to this sort of abuse. And unfortunately, the longer you stay, the more you stay, the more likely it is that one day you're going to be seriously injured, because it gets worse. It doesn't ever resolve itself. It doesn't actually get any better. Now here's the last photo we saw was his booking photo. Here's a nice photo of him. Them to explain how he received his injuries. And that was important. That's an important part of the investigation. And so the officer was like, your story doesn't make any sense. You know, whatever they were trying, like I said, we don't have any details on what excuse they were using, but whatever it was, it didn't make any sense in light of the fact that he also had injuries that they just couldn't explain. So once again, you know, this is something that this time they got caught. Like he obviously took it to another level this time, where she required she required medical assistance. So so I'm getting some feedback on the audio that we're now back. So very good. Sally, good evening and welcome to the program. So today I just want to say it was Mental Health Day. And obviously, there are a lot of mental health issues that plague people. The symposium today was specific to mental health implications when it comes to domestic abuse. One of the things that I learned a number of years ago, and to me this is so incredibly fascinating, is that when a child experiences violence in their life, the DNA structure of that child is altered. We're talking about long-term sustained abuse, which a lot of domestic homes, that's what's happening, right? So day in and day out, people are exposed to trauma. So it's any form of trauma. Domestic abuse, domestic violence is a form of trauma. Psychological abuse, psychological sexual violence, those are examples of trauma. So when an individual, especially a child, sustains trauma in their lifetime, their DNA, and you know, our DNA is the fiber of what we're made up of physically. So, you know, they're always talking about finding DNA markers for different things. So DNA markers for diseases, and, you know, there's one that determines what your skin color is going to be, what the color of your eyes are. You know, they've discovered a lot about DNA. They haven't done, I don't think, the complete, what they call the genome of the DNA, where they go through and they plot out like what every single DNA markers for. And, as science becomes more complex, they're able to identify new things. Like, if you have this particular variation on this portion of your DNA code, that means you might be more susceptible to certain like diseases and stuff like that. So it's a whole science, right? But they have actually discovered that your DNA is altered when you go through sustained life trauma. So if you grew up in a home where you're subjected to constant stresses on the body of being abused, or even just witnessing it, because some children themselves are not direct victims in the sense that they are not being hit physically, but they are witnessing a parent beating another parent, a parent yelling at another parent, and this is a constant, it's like being in a war zone. And this is not to be taken lightly, and this is why I'm taking the time to kind of explain this, because evidence now demonstrates that that person's DNA is changed. And not only is it changed for them, but it is then passed on to future generations. And it's changed for their offspring and so on. So when we think about what the implications of this means, when I hear someone like Dr. Frank, for example, talk about the importance of us accepting our culture and our history of being a country that was a slave territory. So we had slaves here. A lot of us and our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents are the product of that slave history and that slave mentality. And they were slave owners and slaves, and it may not have been the worst of the worst when it came to how slaves were treated here, because there wasn't like a lot of farming in this community. There was small scale farming. So they might not have been out in big cotton fields like what they had in other jurisdictions, but slavery is slavery. And there were a lot of slaves who were subjected to all sorts of horrible things, being sexually assaulted by their slave masters on a regular basis, being beaten, being subjected to really poor conditions. So all of that would have changed the DNA of our forefathers, our grandparents, our great-grandparents. And so that has, by extension, changed our DNA and who we are. And there's now a real question of how does it change your DNA? It changes your ability to cope with certain situations, and it also changes your response, how you respond and how certain things will trigger you. So, there's this thinking that, okay, people of color are more violent people. Well, there could be an actual logical explanation for why that perception is there, because their DNA has been altered because of their slave history. So what I want to say to that is, no matter who you are, white, black, Asian, whatever, if you live in a home where you're constantly being bombarded by those things, and you are especially, putting your children in a situation where they're being exposed to that, try to understand the real life implications run deep for your child and any subsequent children and people down the line. And so that's the level of depth that we are talking about when we talk about the impacts of abuse. It's humongous. Okay, let me go to some of your comments. Shara says, I feel that the police here needs to be trained to handle domestic abuse different than they currently are handling it. And you know what? We did hear at the symposium today that there have been some strides in that direction. There is a family support unit, FSU, within the police department that deals with a lot of family-related issues, so domestic abuse, child abuse, and so on. That would fall under their specific remit. So we do understand that those things are starting to improve. But Shara, I think you're right when you say that, maybe the change needs to be a bit more drastic. One of the other concerns that I've always had is a large portion of our police force is recruited from countries that have a horrendous record of dealing with domestic abuse situations, and of course they are bringing in their previous experiences, their culture of how they have handled things in the past, or how they even see women and men in domestic situations into the mix. And, that obviously will impact how they handle investigations, how they handle victims, and so on. So these are some of the real world implications of what's happening. Cameron says we really need to know what and who to consider in mental health. What and who to consider mental health. We have so much more experts these days, and things still getting worse. Education is key, simplicity too. Well, at the symposium today, they gave some definitions, I think, of what abuse is, and the different types of abuse, how it can be demonstrated. So absolutely, when it comes to education is the key. Educating children that certain behavior is not acceptable. Educating parents, because remember now, if you come from an environment where that was your normal, you grew up with parents who were always fighting and cursing and beating each other up, despite your best efforts to stop that, oftentimes without professional intervention, without you going to professional, for psychological treatment, psychological help, coping mechanisms, you often resort back to what you know. And we all know this from experience. You come out of a situation and you think, oh, I will never marry anyone like that. My children will never endure this. And you make all sorts of promises. And when life begins and life stresses put you in different situations, the next thing you know, you end up being the exact same position, repeating history all over again. And it's pretty scary, but this is exactly what happens. And that's why they say there is a cycle of abuse, and not just within a particular home between the people who are, engaged in it, but the cycle continues from one generation to the next. All right, Shauna says some people who become abusers have a history of abuse if you look back on their life. Absolutely. A history of being exposed to it. Oftentimes they grew up in homes where one parent was involved as an aggressor and there was a victim in the house. Perhaps they were even victimized themselves. Even bullies, we talk a lot about bullies in our schools. A lot of those children are coming from dysfunctional homes, dysfunctional environments where they are being subjected to this. They're being exposed to it. And again, as a result of that exposure, and most people somehow perceiving in their mind's eye that behavior is normal. As a result of all of that, you will find that you are more likely to become, as an adult, involved in that type of relationship. There is a direct correlation. There's a direct linkage to that. And that's why it's so important to try to get more normal homes, people who can communicate, and children being in homes and an environment where they are not being subjected to this. Because children learn what they see. They learn what they experience on a daily basis. And one of my pet peeves, as you guys will know, and we are going to have this discussion at some point, is children who are being chastised, physically beaten. And Caribbean people believe in this. And that's one of the reasons we probably continue to struggle with domestic violence. Because on the one hand, you can't tell a child that I'm going to beat you because I love you. And we say things like, oh, I'm going to whoop your ass. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that because I love you. And then not have that child go out in the real world and come upon an abuser who abuses them, but says, oh, I love you. And the message to that now child who's now an adult, okay, well, this is possible because my mommy used to beat me, but she loved me. And she said that she loved me. So if John Ebanks beats me in a relationship and he says that he loves me, then that's possible because that happened to me before. My mom taught me that, yes, she loves me. She cares about me. She wants the best for me, but she's still going to beat me. So it's like you're sending a message that you're almost preparing, I think, children to be more likely to be involved in domestic violence, involved in domestic situations because of that message that you're sending. And the bottom line is pain begets pain, violence begets violence, no matter what the explanation is for the violence. And the fact that we can't see a home, or we can't envision a home or an environment where a child can grow up totally functional, having a good home without turning out to be a good, productive person, without actually being beaten to become that good, productive person. This is a direct result of our slave days and our slave history. The slave masters beat us into submission. And if you didn't do what you were told, or you didn't do what was right, you got beaten. And that was the end result. And the only way that they could control you was by fear, and that fear of what the repercussions would be if you disobeyed your slave master. So if you did something that they did not agree with, that they did not like, and sometimes that meant you weren't actually doing anything wrong, but maybe you didn't want to sleep with your master in the house at night. No. That's not acceptable. He was going to whoop your ass. Literally, he was going to beat you. And that beating is a way to subject people, to make them submit to you. And so that's the exact same reason that we beat our children, because we want them to subject to us and to listen to us. And the irony of it is, in my mind, we end up creating children who are more violent as a result of what they're being exposed to. But we continue to justify it. And we use the almighty book of the Bible to justify it, because the Bible says not to spare the rod and spoil the child. And these types of sayings, when we really delve into them, the rod of correction, which is, they use this analogy about the sheep herder and his cattle. The rod of correction isn't him beating his sheep. I have never in my life seen a cattle herder or sheep herder or whatever actually beat a sheep before. That's not how he corrected them. It's actually a very gentle process, right? They use dogs to control the sheep and to go in a certain direction. And the rod, they might just press it up against you to say, as a sheep, we want you to go this way. It's not about beating the sheep at all. It's not about forcing the sheep physically to submit in that way. So it's so ironic when we stick to our guns with that, because we feel so passionate about it. And then everybody says, oh, well, I was beaten and I'm fine. What person do you know that is psychologically damaged and has issues that thinks that they have issues? I mean, most of us have psychological issues that we need to be dealing with. And we're like, oh, no, I'm fine. I'm good. I'm a productive person. You're not a productive person just because you can hold down a job. You're not a productive person just because, or an undamaged person, just because you've never been incarcerated or you've never been arrested. You might be struggling with a lot of inner demons outside and beyond that. You might be in an abusive relationship. You might be the aggressor, but still you've never been arrested. You hold down a job. So to say that, oh, you're okay, despite the fact that you got beat, that's not good logic as to why we should continue doing this to our children. And like I said, one of these days, I really want for us to maybe have that discussion. So Shara says, I agree, and we need to teach everyone that that there are many forms of abuse. It's not acceptable, period. Cameron says that it resonates. Evelyn says, my granny bust my ass for nothing. And I mean, the question I would have, Evelyn, is what did that teach you? You know what I'm saying? Did that make you a better person? No, that just taught you that to be fearful of your grandmother, that she would bust your ass, she'd slap you, she'd do all these things to you, and you had to subject to her. So whenever she said something, chances are you did it not because you were a better person because of the beatings, you just did it out of fear of being beat or being slapped or having your ass whooped or whatever we want to call it. Okay, folks, well, guess what? We're out of time. So I do want to play this video again because I'm not sure that you guys were able to actually hear it during the